welcome to the debate. Imagine for a moment that you are a military veteran. You spent the last 10 years leading teams through, life or death logistics crises.
High stakes.
Exactly. High stakes. You are managing complex supply lines under hostile conditions, mitigating catastrophic risks in real time, and you build this deep operational trust with every single person under your command.
Right. Real capability.
Yeah, real tested capability. Then you transition to the civilian workforce. You submit an application for a project management role only to have an automated algorithm reject you like 3 seconds later. Why? Because your profile doesn't include the specific corporate phrasing, supply chain optimization.
It is an incredibly agonizing scenario. And unfortunately, it's one that plays out thousands of times a day. It really does. And that scenario strikes right at the heart of what we are examining today from the Living Professional Record Doctrine, or the LPR. We are looking at a phenomenon the material calls the qualified but unreadable dilemma. The foundational reality here is that being qualified is fundamentally not the same as being readable.
Right. A professional can possess immense capability, deep operational intelligence, and years of earned trust, yet remain completely illegible to the systems trying to evaluate them.
Exactly.
And the doctrine is explicit that this happens across the board. It happens to veterans, caregivers, older workers.
Career changers. Yeah, career changers, generalists, founders. It happens to teachers, changing fields, and frontline workers. Basically anyone with a nonlinear work history. The material points out that it also happens when a person's strongest work was confidential, purely internal, highly relational, or otherwise undocumented by traditional metrics.
Exactly. The source material states that we shouldn't assume silence means the client lacks value, but we also can't assume that their value will be automatically obvious to the market. So the core question we are debating today is about the root cause of this dilemma. When capable professionals fail to translate their value to the market, who or what is fundamentally at fault?
The central question.
Right. Is this unreadability primarily caused by the inherent reductive limitations of what the doctrine calls professional surfaces, things like resumes, applicant tracking systems, AI summaries? Or is it caused by the worker's failure to curate and govern a private source layer of evidence beneath that surface? I will be taking the advocate position. The fault lies entirely with the systems. Interpretation systems and professional surfaces are structurally flawed and inherently designed to strip nuance from complex careers.
And I will be taking the opposing view. I will argue that unreadability is not a failure of the format itself. The professional surface is just doing its job. Rather, the problem is a failure of evidence and source governance on the part of the professional. Unreadability is a curable condition, provided the worker builds the right foundation.
Well, let's start with the nature of the professional surface itself. When we talk about a surface, a resume, a parsed application form, a LinkedIn profile, these are what the doctrine calls rendering interfaces. And by definition, they actively compress a worker's signal.
They summarize, sure.
They don't just summarize, they shrink it. Think about that teacher orchestrating the social-emotional dynamics of a 30-student classroom, or the founder who wore 10 different hats just to keep a startup alive. The hiring system demands a specific, rigid syntax of scale-driven corporate metrics. It forces them into a tiny, predefined box, and when their nuanced reality doesn't perfectly fit, they are deemed unreadable. That is a systemic interpretation failure.
I hear your frustration with the system, I really do, but you're treating the resume like it's some neutral vessel that the market is actively weaponizing against people. I come at it from a completely different way. The fault lies not in the surface, but in the absence of a governed source layer beneath it.
A source layer meaning the underlying proof of their work?
Exactly. The resume was never the real problem. The problem is that professionals try to solve an evidence gap by polishing their language. They rely on what the LPR framework calls generic professionalism. They throw out phrases like results-driven leader or collaborative problem solver because their actual record of work is scattered or undocumented. Unreadability happens because workers haven't translated the vague, internal feeling of "I know I did good work" into a rigorous framework.
But You're assuming the system even wants that rigorous framework. I'm arguing the system doesn't care. Let's use an analogy. If a worker's complex experience is a massive, intricate mountain range, you are arguing we just need a better, more detailed survey of the territory. You want the worker to catalog their evidence better.
Right. Map the territory.
But I'm arguing the map itself is printed on a postage stamp. It structurally cannot hold the mountains. The surface will always flatten the reality of the work, regardless of how well-governed your private evidence is. A resume bullet point simply cannot carry the operational texture of that veteran navigating supply movement, readiness, constraints, and life or death risk. It just becomes 2 words: manage logistics.
The postage stamp analogy is vivid, I'll give you that, but I think you are expecting the postage stamp to do a job it was never designed to do.
Which is properly evaluate human capability.
No, the doctrine explicitly states that in the LPR system, the resume is demoted. It is no longer the source of professional truth. It is merely an output. Yes, the resume is small, but if you have a robust private source layer beneath it, you can render the exact specific coordinates needed for that specific audience onto that stamp. The flattening only happens when the worker has no source material to draw from, and they're just guessing at what the system wants to hear.
Let's break down how this actually plays out mechanically, though. Take a frontline worker. You have someone managing a retail floor who silently prevents an operational disaster before it happens. They spot a catastrophic flaw in a delivery schedule, they fix it on the fly, no money is lost, and the crisis is averted.
A huge operational win.
Exactly. But it is entirely undocumented by management. When the system looks at their profile and sees a lack of traditional, measurable metrics, it reads that silence as a lack of value. It's like the applicant tracking system is a bouncer at a club.
Okay, I like that.
But instead of checking if you're actually a good person to have inside, the bouncer is only checking if you have exactly 4 buttons on your shirt. The system imposes a blindness to actual operational capability.
Let me stop you right there because I like the bouncer analogy, but you are completely missing why the bouncer is checking the buttons. The system isn't blind, it is starved for trust density.
Trust density. Define how you're using that term in this context.
Trust density is essentially the weight of verifiable truth behind a claim. When your frontline worker just says, "I am a proactive problem solver," that sounds competent, but it carries 0 operational reality. It has no trust density.
Right.
The system rejects it because it is an unsupported assertion, not because the system fundamentally hates retail workers.
Professional value has to be made legible.
So how does this worker practically fix that, in your view? If the incident wasn't formally documented by the company, what are they supposed to do?
This is where the transition from generic to grounded professionalism happens in the doctrine. The LPR method forces the worker to move away from simply saying, "I know I did good work." Instead, they build that private source layer.
Practically speaking, how? Literally, they create a structured private record, maybe a secure database or a detailed journal, where they articulate the chain of events. The methodology is very specific. Here's what happened, here's what supports it, here's what it means, and here's what can be safely rendered to the public. If they do that, the bouncer lets them in, because they aren't just wearing the right shirt. They have the verifiable context that proves they belong there.
But that assumes the bouncer is willing to look past the dress code to read the context. If the applicant tracking system is programmed to instantly filter out any resume without a bachelor's degree or without the exact keyword, Six Sigma certification, all that beautifully governed internal context is useless.
Well,
The system filters them out before a human being ever has a chance to evaluate their trust density. That's why I maintain that the format itself is the ultimate bottleneck. It shrinks the signal before the signal even has a chance to be interpreted.
I don't disagree that ATS filters are rigid, but if the candidate has governed their source material, they know exactly which keywords are actually true to their experience, and they can legitimately map their operational reality to the language the system demands. They aren't lying to the ATS, they are translating for it.
Let's test that idea against the current technological reality, specifically the impact of artificial intelligence. Because to me, AI has completely exposed the systemic flaw of professional services. AI changes the trust environment entirely.
How so?
Because it makes polished professional language incredibly easy and cheap to generate. The market is now absolutely flooded with applicants claiming to be, strategic AI transformation leaders.
Oh, absolutely. The fluff is everywhere.
Right. AI inflates claims, it genericizes deeply personal experience into bland corporate speak, and it even invents qualifications out of whole cloth. Because the interpretation systems rely on these surface-level documents, they cannot tell the difference between a fluent AI hallucination and a genuinely qualified but unreadable candidate who didn't use a chatbot to write their resume. The surface environment is fundamentally untrustworthy. It actively penalizes the real worker while rewarding the algorithmically generated mirage.
I actually think AI proves my point perfectly. You are absolutely right that AI changes the trust environment, but the doctrine is extremely precise here. AI changes the cost of sounding qualified. It does not change the evidence required to actually be qualified.
But the system accepts the cheap surface. It lets the mirage through the door.
Temporarily, maybe. AI makes it incredibly cheap to produce a surface, but that is exactly why the source layer is more vital than ever. When an AI resume draft fails, or when a candidate inflates a claim and gets painfully unmasked in an interview, it is precisely because the worker treated the AI output as their source material. They let the AI invent the claim rather than using the AI merely as a rendering assistant to translate their existing governed evidence.
Walk me through what that looks like in practice. How does someone use AI correctly under this LPR framework?
Okay, say you have a worker who spent the last 6 months experimenting with different language models to speed up their team's daily reporting. They documented this in their private source layer. They tracked the dates, the specific prompts they tested, the hours saved, and the errors they caught. That private record is the evidence.
Okay, they have the data.
Right. They can then use an AI tool to help them translate that private record into a grounded public claim for their resume. Something like developed practical workflow literacy through prompt testing, reducing report generation time by 2 hours a week. That is true, it is grounded, and it has immense trust density. But if they don't have that private record first, the AI just generates that generic transformation leader fluff. The breakdown isn't the surface. The breakdown is the lack of accountability to an underlying source.
You're saying about the mechanics of using AI properly as a translation tool. It makes sense. But you were still letting the evaluation system off the hook. If the system is willing to accept the AI fluff until it's painfully unmasked later, the system is fundamentally broken. It prioritizes polish over proof at the surface level. And I want to push this into the realm of privacy and nonlinear gaps, because this is where the structural rigidity of these surfaces does the most profound damage to real people. I want to talk about the caregiver scenario outlined in the material.
That is a critical use case and one of the most difficult.
It is agonizing. You have someone who is out of the traditional workforce for 4 years, caring for a terminally ill family member. During that time, they are navigating incredibly complex medical bureaucracies. They are advocating for resources, managing intricate medication schedules, handling crisis coordination with insurance companies. That is intense, high-stakes operational reality.
Absolutely. The capability required there is massive.
But how can a surface adequately capture that multi-year operational reality without forcing the person to expose deeply private, painful context to a total stranger? The surface forces a draconian compromise. Either you remain illegible and your last 4 years look empty to the algorithm, or you violate your own privacy to prove your capability to an ATS. The format itself is demanding something inherently invasive.
I completely agree that the caregiving scenario is one of the most sensitive situations a professional can face. But your conclusion that the surface is to blame misses the elegant solution the doctrine provides. This tension is exactly why the LPR framework permanently separates the record from the rendering.
Break that down. How does a caregiver practically do that without overexposing themselves?
Well, if a resume is all a person has, yes, they are trapped. The surface demands a label and they are stuck. But with a private source layer, the complex reality of that medical advocacy and resource navigation is preserved safely. Let's say they keep a secure, private ledger of their activities. The crisis management, the schedule optimization, the insurance negotiations, it is all documented. The evidence is gathered, but it remains entirely private.
Okay.
Then the advisor helps the client make what the doctrine calls a public safe rendering. The public resume, the surface, might simply state family caregiving responsibilities for those 4 years. That explains the timeline to the system without overexposing the client's trauma. But if they later pivot into, say, patient advocacy, or healthcare administration, they have the private operational proof ready. They can discuss it in an interview context where it is safe, relevant, and appropriate to do so. Unreadability is solved through strict governance, rendering only what is appropriate for the specific audience without ever violating privacy.
I appreciate the mechanics of that.
It is a highly practical workaround. But we need to slow down and look at the philosophical cost here. The doctrine introduces a concept called the dignity boundary, and we have to unpack the weight of that.
We do. It's arguably the most important concept in the material.
The dignity boundary asserts that human worth does not depend on employability, and it certainly does not depend on evidence. Yet the very fact that we are sitting here discussing how a caregiver must meticulously catalog their family trauma into a private database just to be granted an opportunity by a hiring system, well, it proves my point entirely.
I wouldn't say it proves your point.
It absolutely does. The record exists solely because these systems demand proof before offering opportunity. This inherently commodifies the human experience. We are taking someone's darkest, most exhausting personal years and telling them, hey, make sure you document your crisis coordination so the algorithm knows you have value. The system's inability to interpret human complexity without requiring a documented audit trail is a massive, systemic failure of interpretation. We are forcing individuals to become archivists of their own existence just to survive the interpretation problem.
I share your deep respect for the dignity boundary. It is, frankly, the moral anchor of the entire doctrine. A person is not more human because they have a strong record, and they are not less worthy because their evidence is scattered or undocumented. But we have to operate in reality.
A reality where systems demand commodification.
No, a reality where systems, whether they are companies, universities, or hospitals, need to allocate resources, manage risk, and predict performance. They cannot run on blind faith. That isn't a systemic flaw. It is the basic physics of organizational trust. The system doesn't ask for an audit trail to commodify you. It asks for proof because it is absorbing the risk of hiring you and integrating you into their operations.
But it is still reducing the human to a risk metric.
Building a worker-owned evidence layer isn't about submitting to that metric. It's the exact opposite. It's about taking control of your professional truth before the platform, the algorithm, or the recruiter interprets it for you. It empowers the worker to say, I own my narrative, I govern my evidence, and I will render for you only what I choose. It is a defense mechanism against commodification, not a symptom of it.
That is a very robust defense of the framework. But as we look to wrap up this debate, I have to maintain my position. The interpretation problem represents a fundamental structural flaw in how systems evaluate human capability. When we look at professional services, whether they are parsed by an ATS checking for keywords like a bouncer or summarized by an AI generating corporate fluff, they constantly threaten to flatten, misread, or entirely erase the nuanced, nonlinear paths of veterans, career changers, and caregivers. The demand to shrink a complex career into a recognizable syntax is a systemic issue, and the burden shouldn't fall entirely on the worker to bridge that massive gap.
I hear your concerns, and the systemic hurdles are very real. But my position remains that unreadability is largely a curable condition. Yes, systems demand legibility, but that is a reality we must navigate, not just critique. By methodically building a worker-owned source layer beneath the professional surface, individuals can stop relying on generic polish. They can transition from the vague feeling of, I know I did good work, to rendering grounded, truthful, and private claims. The surface isn't the enemy, the absence of governed evidence is.
Well, despite our profound disagreement on the root cause of this interpretation problem, I think we absolutely converge on a fundamental doctrine from the material. The resume is not the record.
Completely agreed. It is merely a rendering. Treating the resume as the ultimate source of truth is a mistake that deeply harms professionals.
And I know we are equally aligned on the dignity boundary. Regardless of whether you blame the reductum system or the lack of governed evidence, a person's worth is entirely independent of their legibility to a hiring manager. A scattered record does not mean a lesser professional, and it certainly does not mean a lesser human being.
I couldn't agree more. And that's exactly why this framework matters so much.
Understanding the deep distinction between raw capability and market legibility empowers professionals. It shifts the entire paradigm from how do I make myself sound impressive to an algorithm to how do I govern what is true?
Precisely. We'll leave it to the listener to decide which perspective resonates more deeply with their own professional journey. The next time you find yourself trying to compress the vast, complex reality of your career to fit the demands of a hiring algorithm, ask yourself what is being lost in the translation and where the true map of your capability actually lives. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.